When you really step back and think about history, about stories that have lasted thousands of years, it's wild how certain figures just stand above the rest. You can look at every culture, every civilization, every religion, and you'll find legends of kings, warriors, prophets, and philosophers. But what's really fascinating is when a single figure, a woman, rises in a world dominated by men and becomes so revered that she's not just remembered, she's honored as the very definition of purity, faith, and resilience. And in the Quran, there's one name that does that unlike anyone else. Maryam, the mother of Jesus, known as Mary in the Christian tradition. Most people in the West don't realize this, but Maryam is actually the most mentioned woman in the entire Quran. In fact, she's the only woman who has a whole chapter named after her. Think about that. Out of all the countless figures in Islamic scripture, this one woman is singled out, placed in the spotlight, and remembered for centuries as a symbol of devotion to God. And here's the crazy part. She's mentioned more times in the Quran than in the New Testament. That blows people's minds when they first hear it, because the assumption is always that she's central to Christianity, but only a footnote in Islam. The reality is the opposite. She's elevated, protected, and recognized in Islam in a way that feels almost unparalleled. But let's rewind. Let's take it back to the setting where Maryam's story begins. We're talking about ancient Jerusalem, a society rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and expectations. Women back then didn't have the kind of freedom we associate with modern life. Their roles were defined by family, lineage, and service. Yet Miriam comes onto the scene in a way that already defies expectations. Her parents dedicate her entirely to God even before she's born. They make a vow that this child, whoever she is, will be given in service to the temple. So from day one, her life isn't about marriage, wealth, or social climbing. It's about devotion, spiritual connection, and sacrifice. And that's where things start to get really interesting. The Quran paints this picture of Maryam growing up under the care of a prophet named Zachariah, someone who recognizes her spiritual purity from the very beginning. And here's this insane detail: every time he checks in on her, he finds her already blessed with provisions, food, sustenance that no one gave her. It's as if God Himself is directly nourishing her. That's a huge statement because it's saying she's not just devout, she's chosen. She's tapped into a divine connection that transcends anything the people around her can understand. That sets the stage for what's coming. And what's coming, of course, is the single most miraculous event tied to her name: the birth of Jesus. But before we jump straight to that, you've got to sit with this context, because the Quran is not just throwing in random miracles. It's laying a foundation, a storyline where Maryam's purity and devotion are front and center. She's not a side character. She's not just a vessel for another prophet's arrival. She's an active symbol of faith, chosen to carry out one of the most mysterious and awe-inspiring acts in human history. Now, why does this matter? Why is Maryam's story so powerful? Because when you strip away all the cultural baggage and theological debates, what you see is this. In a society where women were often overlooked, here's a woman being elevated beyond kings, beyond priests, beyond rulers. She becomes the ultimate example of someone who fully trusts God, even when the world can't possibly understand her. And that's timeless. That's not just an old story. That resonates with anyone who's ever felt misunderstood, anyone who's ever been judged, anyone who's ever carried a burden that people couldn't comprehend. Here's another wild thing. In the Quran, Maryam is explicitly described as the most pure woman in the world. Imagine what that meant to early listeners in a culture where lineage and reputation meant everything. The text is saying, No matter what you think you know, this woman is untouchable in her faith, untouchable in her honor. And that's not just a statement of respect. It's a defense, a shield against the criticism she would inevitably face. Because remember, her story involves the impossible, giving birth without ever being with a man. You can only imagine how society looked at that. People would gossip, accuse, spread rumors, and yet the Quran places her story front and center to say, this isn't scandal, this is sacred. So, in chapter 19 of the Quran, the chapter actually named after her, you see this incredible narrative unfold. Maryam withdraws from her people, seeking solitude. She's visited by an angel who delivers the message she's going to bear a child. Think about the weight of that. You're a woman devoted entirely to God. You've never been with a man. You've dedicated your entire life to purity. And now you're told you're going to have a child. For most people, that would shatter their world, but for Maryam, it becomes the ultimate test of faith. She doesn't collapse under the pressure. She doesn't lash out in anger. She surrenders to the will of God, even knowing the firestorm of accusations that's about to come. And when the birth of Jesus finally happens, it's not in a palace, not in a temple, not in a comfortable setting. It's in the wilderness, under a palm tree, in the most raw and vulnerable state imaginable. She's alone, she's in pain, she's terrified. But even then, divine help comes to her. A voice reassures her. The earth itself provides her with sustenance, dates from the palm, water from a stream. It's as if nature itself bends to protect her. That's powerful imagery. That's the kind of storytelling that sticks with you, because it's not just about one woman's struggle. It's about the way faith transforms suffering into purpose. So when people today talk about Maryam as the most powerful woman in the Quran, they're not exaggerating. She embodies strength, resilience, and faith in a way that's so raw, so real, that it still inspires people 1,400 years later. And in a world where women were often silenced, her story roars across time with more intensity than any king's decree or warrior's conquest. That's why she matters. That's why she's remembered, and this is just the beginning. Because once Jesus enters the story, once that miracle unfolds, the controversy, the symbolism, and the deeper meaning all explode into something much bigger. Her role isn't just about giving birth. It's about standing as the ultimate witness to God's power, a woman whose life flips every cultural expectation upside down. When you really zoom in on Maryam's story, it's not just about her strength in isolation. It's about the way her life collides with one of the most extraordinary events in human history, the birth of Jesus, or Isa as he's called in the Quran. And here's where the story gets intense, because it's not just about a miracle happening. It's about what that miracle meant for her reputation, for her people, and for the entire narrative of faith. Moving forward, imagine the scene, you're Maryam. You've just gone through this lonely, excruciating process of giving birth in the wilderness. No one's there to help you, no midwives, no family, no comfort. Just you under a palm tree with pain and fear crashing down on you like a tidal wave. And then it happens. The child is born. But this isn't just any child. This is the miracle child, the one who arrives without a father, the one who instantly becomes a living testimony to God's will. And now your responsibility shifts, because it's not just about surviving childbirth. It's about walking back into society, holding this infant in your arms and facing the full force of disbelief, accusation, and judgment. The Quran captures this moment with an almost cinematic intensity. Maryam returns to her people carrying the baby, and immediately the backlash begins. The whispers, the raised eyebrows, the angry voices, all of them saying the same thing. What have you done? And you've got to put yourself in her shoes to feel the weight of this. She's devoted her entire life to purity, to God, to service. Her reputation is spotless, and in a single moment, it all looks shattered in the eyes of her community. To them, it's simple math. You have a child, there's no husband, so you must have sinned. It's that brutal, that unforgiving. But here's the twist. Miriam doesn't respond with angry defenses. She doesn't try to argue or shout or plead her case. The Quran shows her in a state of silence, pointing instead to the infant in her arms. And this is where the story takes a turn into the miraculous. Because that child, Isa, speaks, a newborn baby in the cradle, addressing the crowd directly. He says, in essence, I am the servant of God. He has given me the scripture and made me a prophet. Can you imagine being in that crowd? You come in ready to shame her, ready to humiliate her, and instead you witness a baby talking, declaring his divine mission. That's a moment that flips the script entirely. Now, let's pause here. Because whether you're deeply religious or just someone fascinated by human stories, this scene is powerful on multiple levels. First, it shows the magnitude of Miriam's role. She doesn't have to fight her battles with words, God fights them for her. Her vindication doesn't come from clever arguments or social power. It comes from the miraculous truth itself. Second, it shows how faith sometimes puts you in impossible situations. Imagine being asked to carry that weight, knowing full well people will never believe you, until the miracle unfolds right in front of them. That's a type of faith most of us can barely wrap our heads around, and the baby's speech. That's not just a defense of Miriam. That's a declaration that something huge has entered the world. Isa is introduced not just as a miracle birth, but as someone who already carries divine authority from the very first moment of his life. In a way, Miriam's silence, her refusal to argue, becomes a lesson in itself. Sometimes the truth doesn't need defending. Sometimes it just reveals itself in a way so undeniable that everything else crumbles. But don't think for a second that this miracle made life easy for her. Because, while it may have silenced some critics in that moment, the bigger controversy was only beginning. Think about the theological earthquake this caused. You've got a child born without a father. You've got a mother whose entire life was centered on purity and devotion. And you've got a society that doesn't know what to do with that information. Do they accept it as divine will? Do they dismiss it as something unnatural? Do they twist it into a weapon against her? These are the questions that hung in the air, and they didn't go away. Miriam's life after this miracle wasn't one of peace and comfort. It was one of constant scrutiny, people projecting their doubts onto her, people using her story as a battleground for their own beliefs. That's something people today can still relate to. You carry something heavy, something others don't understand, and suddenly your life isn't your own anymore. It becomes public property, debated, judged, dissected. That's what Miriam lived through every day. And what makes her so powerful in the Quranic narrative is how she carried that weight without ever losing her connection to God. She didn't break. She didn't let bitterness consume her. She didn't allow society's accusations to define her. Instead, she embodied a kind of resilience that goes beyond ordinary strength. It's not just physical endurance. It's spiritual endurance, the kind that allows you to stand tall when the entire world wants to see you fall. Now, here's something else to think about. In the Quran, Isa's miraculous speech as an infant isn't just a defense of his mother. It's also a warning shot to the people around him. It's like a cosmic announcement. This child is not ordinary, and you'd better pay attention. That moment puts Miriam and Isra right at the center of divine history. From here on out, their lives are inseparable from the story of revelation, prophecy, and humanity's struggle to recognize truth when it's staring them in the face. And this is why Miriam's role isn't passive. People sometimes look at her as just the mother of a prophet. But in the Quranic perspective, she is an active, powerful figure whose own trials are central to the message. Her suffering, her vindication, her faith, they're not side notes. They're essential chapters in the bigger story of how God works in the world. And that's something we need to recognize, because let's be honest, how often do we see stories where a woman is the hero of faith? Not the queen, not the warrior, not the wife of a powerful man, but the one chosen directly by God to carry the heaviest responsibility imaginable. That's Miriam, and that's why she's remembered not just as the mother of Isa, but as a figure of immense spiritual power in her own right. So when you step back, you see this incredible duality. On one hand, Miriam is vulnerable, isolated, a single woman carrying a child against all social norms. On the other hand, she's unbreakable, chosen, elevated by God beyond anyone's comprehension. That balance between fragility and strength, between suffering and transcendence, is what makes her story so universally compelling. And here's the kicker: the Quran doesn't shy away from showing her humanity. It describes her fear, her pain, her despair under that palm tree. It shows her wishing she could disappear, wishing she could escape the judgment. That's not weakness, that's honesty. That's the raw human side of faith, and it makes her resilience even more inspiring because she didn't start as some untouchable saint. She was a human being, crushed by the weight of her situation, and yet she endured. This is the moment where her story shifts from being about one woman's devotion to being about a mother and a child standing as a sign for all of humanity. It's no longer just about Miriam's faith. It's about what her faith makes possible: the birth of a prophet, the continuation of a divine mission, and the redefinition of what it means to trust God completely. And from here, things only get deeper, because the story of Miriam and Isa isn't just about miraculous beginnings. It's about the struggles that come after, the debates, the divisions, the interpretations that shaped entire civilizations. Miriam's role doesn't end with the miracle birth. It carries on through every ripple that moment created in history. Once you understand the miracle of Miriam and Isa's birth, you start to realize that the story doesn't stop there. In fact, that's just the spark. What follows is a ripple effect that spreads across centuries, across continents, and across the very fabric of human belief. Because when you have a miracle that undeniable, that unexplainable, it doesn't just stay in one place. It becomes part of the collective consciousness of humanity, and Miriam's role in that ripple is absolutely central. Here's the thing about miracles: they're never just personal, they're public, they force people to react. And that's exactly what happened with Miriam. She wasn't just a mother raising a child in private. She was suddenly the guardian of a figure who would go on to challenge the very foundations of society. Isa's presence was disruptive. He was a walking contradiction to the established order, and Miriam was the living proof of his legitimacy. So everywhere Isa went, Miriam's name followed. Everywhere Isa taught, people looked back to his mother's story. Her legacy wasn't just about her faith. It was about becoming the anchor of his mission. Now think about the psychological weight of that. You're Miriam, a woman who has already endured accusation, isolation, and the pain of being misunderstood. And now, on top of that, your son grows into someone who is loved by some, hated by others, and targeted by the most powerful authorities of the time. That means every time his name is lifted, yours is dragged with it. Every time he's praised, you're honored. But every time he's attacked, you're vilified. That's a burden most of us could never imagine carrying. And here's the kicker: even as Isa's mission grew, the Quran still goes out of its way to emphasize Maryam's own status. She isn't lost in his shadow. She's continuously described as chosen, as honored, as a sign for all people. That matters because historically, women often get erased once the men step into the spotlight. But here, it's different. Her identity remains distinct, her story remains protected, and her strength remains a lesson in itself. This is where the clash of civilizations comes into play, because Maryam's story doesn't just live in Islam, it's also central in Christianity, and it plays a role in Jewish traditions too, though often with different interpretations. And when you compare those perspectives, you see something fascinating. In Christianity, Mary is revered, absolutely. She's the Virgin Mother, the holy figure who gives birth to Jesus. But in Islam, the reverence goes even deeper. She's not just honored as the mother of a prophet. She's seen as one of the greatest women of all time, period. Her chapter in the Quran isn't a side note. It's an entire standalone narrative, preserved in a way that highlights her dignity and faith above all else. And that's where things get really interesting in the modern context. Because if you fast forward from ancient Jerusalem to today, you realize Maryam is one of the few figures that billions of people agree on. Muslims honor her, Christians honor her, even people outside of faith traditions know her name. She's a unifying figure in a world that's more divided than ever. And that raises the question, why her? What is it about Maryam's story that transcends religion and culture? The answer, I think, lies in the themes of her life: purity, faith, struggle, endurance. These are universal. They're human. You don't need to be religious to understand what it feels like to be judged unfairly. You don't need to memorize scripture to grasp the courage it takes to carry something heavy when everyone doubts you. You don't need to belong to any faith to be inspired by someone who never gave up, even when the world tried to break her. That's why Maryam resonates so deeply, but here's where the clash comes in. Because while Maryam unites people in admiration, her story also divides people in interpretation. For Christians, her legacy is tied to the belief that Jesus is the Son of God. For Muslims, her story is tied to the belief that Jesus is a prophet of God, not divine himself. And for some Jewish traditions, she's not even honored at all. So you've got this fascinating dynamic: one woman, one story, but radically different meanings depending on who you ask. That division has fueled centuries of debate, conflict, and even bloodshed. And yet, through it all, Maryam's name never disappears. She's still there, unshaken, standing in the middle of history as a symbol that refuses to be erased. This is where you realize the power of legacy, because legacy isn't just about what you do in your lifetime. It's about what your life represents after you're gone. Maryam probably didn't set out to become one of the most iconic women in human history. She wasn't chasing fame, power, or recognition. She was simply devoted to God, living her life with sincerity, and yet that sincerity ended up making her a legend. That's a powerful reminder for us today, in a world obsessed with going viral, with being noticed, with chasing likes and followers. Sometimes the most lasting impact comes from simply being real, being authentic, and staying true to your values even when nobody's watching. Now, if you zoom out and look at history, you see that Maryam's story isn't just religious. It's cultural. It's artistic. Think about how many paintings, sculptures, cathedrals, and mosques have honored her image and her name. Think about how many millions of people whisper her name in prayer every single day, across languages, across continents. That's influence on a scale most of us can't even comprehend. And it's not the kind of influence that comes from armies, money, or politics. It comes from faith. That's why it's so enduring, but at the same time, legacy isn't easy, because once your story becomes global, it's no longer in your control. People reinterpret it, reshape it, sometimes even exploit it for their own agendas, and that's exactly what happened with Miriam. Her story has been used to inspire love, but also to justify arguments, to unite people, but also to divide them, to elevate women, but sometimes also to silence them, and that paradox is still with us today. This is where the Quran's framing becomes so important. Because in the middle of all that noise, the Quran insists on anchoring her story in purity and dignity. It cuts through the accusations, the misinterpretations, and the political spin. It says clearly, this woman was chosen. This woman was honored. This woman is a sign for all of humanity. That's a message that outlasts the noise of history. So when we talk about Maryam as the most powerful woman in the Quran, it's not just because of her miracle. It's because of her legacy. It's because her story didn't end with her lifetime. It echoed, it kept moving. It shaped conversations across civilizations, and it still shapes them today. And here's the wild part, that legacy is still unfolding. We're not talking about something that ended centuries ago. We're talking about a story that continues to inspire, continues to challenge, continues to be debated in podcasts, sermons, classrooms, and living rooms around the world. That's the sign of true power, when your story is so big, so meaningful, that it can't be contained by time. When you strip away the ancient context and really zoom in on Maryam's story, it becomes more than just a tale of miracles or theology. It becomes a blueprint for resilience, for faith under fire, and for navigating a world that's quick to judge but slow to understand. And that's why her story matters today just as much as it did centuries ago. Because let's be real, we're living in an age of pressure. Social pressure, online pressure, societal pressure. Everyone's under a microscope, everyone's judged by standards they didn't set, and everyone is fighting to keep their sense of self intact. Maryam's story speaks directly into that. Think about it. Maryam lived in a society that judged harshly, where one rumor could destroy your reputation, where your entire identity was tied to what people thought of you. Sound familiar? That's exactly what social media is today. One misstep, one misunderstood moment, and suddenly the internet has labeled you forever. Cancel culture, gossip, shaming, those aren't new inventions. They're just modern versions of the same human instinct that Maryam faced head on. She walked into her community holding a child and immediately became the target of suspicion. She didn't get the benefit of the doubt. She didn't get compassion. She got condemnation. And how did she handle it? She didn't spiral into defensiveness. She didn't waste her life trying to appease her critics. She stayed rooted in truth, trusting that reality itself would vindicate her. That's a lesson we desperately need today, because in our world we're conditioned to respond instantly, to clap back, to prove ourselves. But sometimes the most powerful move isn't to scream louder. It's to let your life, your integrity, and your consistency speak for themselves. Maryam's silence in the face of accusation wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was discipline, and it paid off because the truth revealed itself through the miracle of Isa speaking. Now, take that same principle into modern life. Imagine you're facing slander at work, drama in your family, or hate online. The instinct is to fight back, to defend yourself at all costs. But what Maryam's story shows is that truth has a way of surfacing when you stay anchored in authenticity. That's not easy. In fact, it's brutally hard, but it's powerful. It's a reminder that your worth isn't defined by the noise around you. It's defined by who you are when no one's watching. Another modern lesson in her story is about carrying burdens that other people can't understand. Maryam carried a child under circumstances no one could comprehend. She bore the weight of a miracle that society mistook for scandal. In a way, that's what so many people experience today, just in different forms. Maybe it's carrying trauma no one else knows about. Maybe it's working on a dream people laugh at. Maybe it's grinding in silence while the world assumes you're failing. Whatever it is, her story reminds us that being misunderstood doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it means you're walking a path so unique that people simply can't wrap their heads around it. And here's where it gets really real. Maryam's pain wasn't hidden. The Quran shows her crying out in despair, wishing she could vanish, wishing she could be forgotten. That level of honesty matters because it tells us that even the strongest people break down. Even the most faithful people feel crushed sometimes. In today's world, where mental health struggles are everywhere, that's a game-changing reminder. It means that despair doesn't disqualify you. Struggle doesn't erase your strength. You can hit rock bottom emotionally and still be one of the most honored, revered, powerful figures in history. That's a lifeline for anyone who feels like their pain makes them weak. Maryam proves that pain and strength can exist side by side. Now, let's talk about gender. In a world where women still fight to be heard, Maryam's story is radical. Here's a woman in a patriarchal society where her voice should have been silenced, and yet her story becomes one of the loudest voices in Scripture. She's not erased, she's not sidelined, she's front and center. That's not just inspirational, it's revolutionary. Because it shows that spiritual power isn't tied to gender, status, or privilege. It's tied to sincerity, courage, and faith. And if Maryam could stand tall in her world, it's a reminder that women today can stand tall in theirs. But let's also flip it. For men, Maryam's story is just as important, because it challenges the idea that strength is only about domination, aggression, or control. Maryam's strength is quiet, it's spiritual, it's rooted in endurance, not aggression. That's a lesson for men in a culture that constantly pressures them to perform toughness. Real toughness sometimes looks like patience, real strength sometimes looks like restraint. That's the kind of strength Maryam embodies, and it's something anyone, man or woman, can learn from. And here's another angle. Maryam's story also teaches us about what it means to raise the next generation. She didn't just give birth to Isa. She raised him, nurtured him, protected him while he grew into one of the most influential figures in history. That's a massive responsibility. And in our world, where parenting often gets reduced to logistics, school runs, bills, activities, her story brings us back to the essence. Parenting isn't just about raising a child to survive. It's about raising a child with purpose, with faith, with a sense of destiny. Whether you're religious or not, that idea hits deep, because it's a reminder that how you shape the next generation can literally change the world. Let's also talk about legacy in the digital age. Everyone today wants to leave a mark. Everyone wants to be remembered. But most of the stuff we chase, likes, views, fame, it disappears overnight. Maryam's story shows that real legacy isn't built on being loud. It's built on being true. It's built on integrity, on aligning your life with something bigger than yourself. That's why her name is still whispered with reverence centuries later. That's why her story still resonates across billions of people. And that's the challenge for us. Are we living for noise, or are we living for legacy? And here's the crazy part. Her story also speaks directly into our current obsession with authenticity. Everyone's talking about being real, but most of what we see online is curated, filtered, fake. Maryam's authenticity wasn't flashy. It wasn't performative. It was tested under the most brutal circumstances imaginable. And that's the kind of authenticity that actually lasts. It's not about proving yourself to the world. It's about being aligned with your truth no matter the cost. So when you take Miriam's story and hold it up against today's struggles, it fits perfectly. She's a model for anyone navigating judgment, misunderstanding, or crushing expectations. She's a symbol of resilience for anyone carrying a hidden burden. She's proof that faith and endurance can outlast gossip, slander, and doubt. And she's a reminder that even when you feel like you're breaking, your story can still inspire generations. Which brings us to the final piece of this breakdown, Chapter 5. Because if Miriam's life gives us timeless lessons, then the real question is, how do we embody them? How do we take her story off the pages of Scripture and actually live it out in the modern world? That's where everything comes together. At this point, when you've walked through Miriam's story from her miraculous birth to her endurance under fire, from the ripple effects of her legacy to the lessons for the modern world, you start to see the bigger picture. You start to realize this isn't just history, it's not just theology, it's a living template for how to face life when the weight of the world is on your shoulders. And if you take it seriously, Miriam's story doesn't just inspire you. It challenges you. It asks you to rethink how you carry yourself, how you face adversity, and how you build your legacy. Let's start with faith, because that's the core of her story. Faith for Miriam wasn't abstract. It wasn't just about reciting words or performing rituals. It was about trusting God when logic, society, and her own emotions all told her to give up. When she stood under that palm tree, crying out that she wished she was dead and forgotten, she was at her lowest point. And yet, in that very moment, God provided her relief. Water appeared, dates fell, the impossible became possible. That's the essence of faith. Believing that when you've reached your limit, when you've got nothing left to give, there's still a source of strength greater than yourself. That's a lesson anyone can take, no matter what they believe, because all of us hit those breaking points. All of us feel like giving up sometimes. Miriam's story says, hold on. Relief can come from places you never expected. Next, let's talk about resilience. We live in a culture that celebrates quick wins, instant gratification, and easy success. But Miriam's story is the opposite. Her strength wasn't built in comfort. It was forged in struggle. Her life shows us that real resilience doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from walking through it, carrying it, and not letting it destroy your core. That's something we all need to remember in an age where the smallest setbacks can feel crushing. Resilience isn't about never breaking down. It's about rising again, even when you've been knocked flat. Then there's the lesson of integrity. Miriam didn't bend to the pressure of society's expectations. She didn't compromise her devotion to God, even when it would have been easier to just blend in and avoid the spotlight. She stayed true to her mission even when it meant carrying a burden she didn't ask for. That's integrity. And in today's world, where compromise is everywhere, where people sell out their values for fame, for money, for approval, her story stands as a reminder that integrity outlasts all of it. Noise fades, trends die, but integrity leaves a legacy that echoes for centuries. And that brings us to legacy itself. Because when you think about it, Miriam's legacy is the ultimate example of how a life lived with sincerity can impact the world in ways you can't predict. She didn't write books, she didn't build empires, she didn't lead armies. She lived a life of quiet devotion, of endurance, of sacrifice. And yet here we are, centuries later, still speaking her name, still learning from her story, still inspired by her faith. That's legacy, and it forces us to ask ourselves, what kind of legacy are we building? Are we living for temporary recognition, or are we building something that will outlast us Miriam's story also pushes us to think about gender and power in new ways. She shows that true power isn't always about dominance. Sometimes it's about surrender, sometimes it's about courage and vulnerability, sometimes it's about carrying a responsibility that terrifies you and still moving forward. In a world that constantly tells women they're not enough, Miriam's story screams the opposite. You are more than enough. You are capable of carrying miracles. You are capable of facing storms. You are capable of being chosen, honored, remembered. And for men, her story is a wake-up call that strength comes in many forms, and some of the most powerful examples of resilience in history come from women who refuse to break under pressure. But here's the most practical takeaway. Miriam's story is about silence, patience, and trust in moments when the noise around you is deafening. When people accused her, she didn't waste her energy trying to convince them. She pointed to the truth and let it speak for itself. In our world where everyone's shouting, where everyone feels the need to prove themselves 24/7, that's revolutionary. It's a call to step back, to breathe, to recognize that sometimes the loudest statement you can make is found in quiet integrity. So, how do we live her legacy today? We live it by facing our own storms with the same courage she showed. We live it by holding on when life tells us to let go. We live it by protecting our integrity even when compromise looks easier. We live it by raising the next generation with purpose, like she raised Issa. And above all, we live it by remembering that being misunderstood isn't failure. It might just mean we're walking a path too rare for people to understand right away. Miriam's story is timeless because it's human. It's about fear, pain, endurance, and ultimate vindication. It's about being crushed by the weight of judgment, but lifted by the weight of truth. It's about being ordinary in the eyes of society, but extraordinary in the eyes of God. And that's why she's the most powerful woman in the Quran. Not because she had wealth, not because she had armies, but because she had unshakable faith, resilience under fire, and a legacy that refuses to fade. So as we close this breakdown, here's the final thought. Maryam's story isn't just for Muslims or Christians or people of faith. It's for anyone who's ever felt misunderstood, anyone who's ever carried something heavy alone, anyone who's ever been judged unfairly, anyone who's ever cried out in despair wondering if relief would ever come. Her story says you're not alone. Your struggle has meaning, your burden can turn into your legacy, and if she could stand tall in the face of it all, so can you. And that's the real power of Maryam, a power that transcends time, transcends religion, transcends culture, a power that belongs not just to her story, but to the human story. And maybe, just maybe, that's why her name still echoes across the world, across centuries, across billions of hearts. Because when you hear her story, you don't just hear about her. You hear about yourself and the strength you didn't know you had.